Thanks for joining. If you're getting on the webinar today and going to spend a little time with us, we're really excited about the topic. It's probably not one that everybody wakes up every morning and goes, oh boy, this is what I want to talk about today. But it is the topic that when it comes up, you want to be able to say, whew, I know what to do here. I've got the answer. And I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. We're so glad today in this series of webinars, of joining with Michael Campbell with Ministry Sure. And then also today, our guest on this webinar is Dawn Sipley. And I'll let her tell you more about her company in just a minute. And she and her husband have both traveled with me to Honduras. And we've been able to get to know them and just awesome people. And so I wanted her as an expert in the HR field to be on today. So Michael, why don't you take just a moment, introduce yourself, and then Dawn, you jump right in there.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Rodney. Michael at Ministry Sure. We help ministries with insurance placement and risk management solutions. Super excited to be here today and kind of help the broader church make wise choices.
Good.
Yep, Dawn Sipley, president of Sipley the Best. We're an HR consulting company that walks alongside of businesses and churches, helping them navigate the people that God has kind of blessed us with in our lives. We also work with job seekers who are trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up and kind of what all that looks like and what their God-given gifts are and how they can market that in the workforce.
That's awesome. And Dawn is also connected to, am I saying it right, the Christian Chamber of Commerce there in Orlando, Florida area. And she and her husband are great believers, and of course Michael and his family as well. So we understand hopefully a lot of things from the business perspective, but we also want you to know we're looking at it and understand it through a ministry lens, and it just makes a little difference hopefully for you as well. So here's the topic for today: is ministry compliant? Really just some HR essentials that we feel every ministry needs. And I want to set the parameter here to understand too. Typically in America, most churches are small churches. And so while there are mega churches and there are mid-size and those, probably today, many of you on the webinar are going to be people who either have no staff, very low staff, understaffed, growing staff. You have a few staff. I don't know. Maybe you have, a really good growing staff. So let's just jump right into the thought and the topic today. Dawn, let's first think about it because I know every church has this. Every church has people who are volunteers, others who are maybe either getting a stipend or part-time salary, or maybe they're full-time salary or independent contractor people. I mean, there's a whole lot going on there. So have I got even that down to where you can just start somewhere, Dawn? Take off.
Yeah. Misclassification of employees is probably one of the largest widely violated areas of employment. Oftentimes employers will think, well, me and this individual agreed they're just going to be a contractor in this role. They don't need to be on payroll. We don't have to pay taxes or provide insurance, and so they'll just operate in that capacity. And they think that that's their decision to make when actually that's not the truth. The Department of Labor is the one that determines whether a person is a 1099 contractor or a W-2 employee. There's a test that you can go on the Department of Labor, DOL.gov, to help you walk through that test. But even more complicated for churches, even if you do have an establishment, whether they're an employee or a contractor, then you have to consider the volunteerism that a lot of our employees are going to do as well. And when does our volunteer work, our work for the Lord, begin, and where does our JOB stop? And so having really clear boundaries on the job description on what that looks like, and then continuing to communicate as events come up or things come up, this is work and this is not work. Having really clear communication can help.
Let's make sure we got that right as well. So they can go to dol.gov, departmentlabor.gov. Okay, cool.
Yep.
So
and just query in what is a contractor and what's the test along with that.
What do you see some of the biggest lines getting crossed here? How does that happen?
Yeah. I think the biggest lines being crossed are through good intention. And work just gets busy, the church gets busy, needs are being responded to, and we just forget, like, what hat am I wearing right now? Am I wearing my pastor hat? Am I wearing my volunteer hat? Am I working in just a brotherhood type of situation? Is this friend that is going through this crisis? Am I taking this call as his pastor or his buddy? And what all of that is. So really it's the lack of language on defining what will be my volunteer role and what will be my job role. And that can oftentimes be solved in a very solid job description, and then really clear communication with your staff on what do you want not to be paid for, right? If you ask people that, they will tell you, you know what, this is my passion and I never want to be paid for that, but I certainly want to be paid for these things. So having that written down and clearly communicated is just the really first step on making sure those boundaries are well understood.
So you can actually ask that, Dawn? I'm actually fascinated that you can ask, what do you not want to get paid for?
Yeah.
How would you document that? What would that look like?
Well, that would be on the job description. So on the job description, it would say these duties for this job will include and anything associated with youth ministry. That's my personal passion, and I would only like to give of my time when I'm connected to the youth ministry type of thing. So it's just a boundary. It's an easy distinction, but a lot of people don't ask to think, what do you not want to be compensated for? What do you want your purpose and passion and calling to demonstrate? And what do you not want it to demonstrate? And then it can allow that individual to really decide personally how they show up for that ministry section of their life and not their job section of their life. Because they can say no to whatever they want in that ministry capacity, just as all of our volunteers at any given time can say, ooh, that might not be for me this time.
Yeah, and I had at one point years back, I had a Christian school, had a lot of teachers and that kind of thing. And then I had a teacher came to me one day when we were talking about volunteering for something we were doing in the church, and she was like, "No, my teaching is my volunteering." And so it's almost like the opposite. I was like, "No, you get paid for this, but we all volunteer in ministry." And so it's kind of both sides of that coin, if you will.
Yeah.
I have one other question on this along the same topic. One of the challenges we've seen is from a budgetary standpoint, given the wages and where things are going these days, churches just don't have as much in their budget allocated for, say, a youth pastor. Yeah. And so, that type of role could be as big or as small as you decide to make it. And so, I feel like, a lot of ministers say, well, you hired me based on 20 hours a week, but there's no way I can do a good job with 20 hours a week. So where do we go from here? Am I taking a 50% pay cut or more in order to do a good job?
Wow.
Yeah, that's where those conversations kind of come in at, and those regular communication, coming in and communicating with your upline or your direct supervisor. It's, to do the Wednesday night event, my preparation is this much time, my during is that much time, my cleanup is this much time. So there's 7 hours, of my youth pastor time outside of that. Would you like me to have touch bases with parents, or, do you want me to monitor group chats of the youth? As the church, what are my duties and responsibilities? And then try to get under every line item of a job description. Unofficially, I like to have the number of hours dedicated to that role. So I understand as an employee or HR or a pastor what is going into that. And if we start deviating too much from that, what is causing that? Is it church growth? Is it church turmoil? Is it rumors? Is it, do we have a circumstance? Is it a season?
Right.
We could do a lot of things for a season, or is this going to retract back? So having that document and allowing that document to be a living document is really powerful as well. You need to revisit it sometimes because our best hearted people are going to serve without looking at the clock, right? And we want to protect them from burnout. And a big trend that I'm seeing right now in the church is sabbatical.
Yeah.
Mandatory sabbaticals being taken every 4, 5, 7 years. I'm seeing where you have to exit leadership for an extended duration, usually several months or a quarter, to focus on you, your family, your children, your wife, your household, because you can't pour from that empty cup.
So, Dawn, there's so many things we could talk about, and now that we're talking, I'm almost seeing sabbatical as a whole nother webinar one day that we need to talk about. So let me back up here and ask you a question.
Yeah.
So if I'm a pastor, and let's say that I only have a 20-hour a week part-time or bivocational youth pastor,
Mm-hmm.
and we are going through this big season. We've got this big Easter, coming up, or camp, and he's got to take this group to camp. So he's having to take off work, do whatever. I'm paying him 20 hours a week, but can I stipend him or bonus him, or what does that look like on certain things?
Yeah, oftentimes you'll see a per diem pay that is involved with that, where given that, say it's like you said, youth group week, and so you're not going to get your regular pay. You're living, you're sleeping there at the camp. So when you're sleeping away from home, per diems are usually very, very normal way to compensate for that extra push during that season.
Yeah, or even just a busy season where he's got to do a lot extra, and I'm asking him to, and so I can give him a bonus or per diem kind of thing.
Yeah.
Dawn, the hardest part, I think, as I'm having conversations with churches is I hear this again and again and again. Well, we 1099 them. We don't need to worry about, the compensation part, the, insurance part, the workers' comp part, whatever Department of Labor regulations. They're just a 1099. We don't need to worry about that. So can you talk to me about that sniff test that the Department of Labor puts out there, kind of like the different criterias, and how do you know when you should be treating them as an employee versus a 1099?
Yeah. So it when you boil it down, it's very easy to distinguish. Are they supplying their own equipment? Okay. Musician leader. Are they showing up with their stuff from their house, their speakers, their drum set, their guitar, their stuff? Are they lending those things to the church for use on stage? Or does the church own all of the worship equipment? Okay, so are they supplying their own supplies themselves? Contractors can have a loss. Contractors are just micro businesses. Can they lose money? Will they spend money on behalf of the church and receive money from the church? Can they have a loss? Are they doing ticket sales or kind of something like that? Are they told when to be there and how to do the job? Those are two really big things. Like if you're like, you have to be here from 8 to 1 Monday through Thursday, those are our office hours. Well, that's not how contractors work. Contractors don't work on a time schedule like that. Now you might require meeting attendance, and those meetings happen to be at a certain time, but you're not telling them how to run their schedule.
So how about a Sunday? You're a worship guy, and I need you here at 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Sunday only.
Yeah, well, that's performance time, and so that's kind of self-dictated by the contract that you will be here to do the performance,
okay,
which is at this time at this place. But you can't tell them like you have to practice 7 hours a week leading up to the Sunday morning service. They can practice 1 hour or the 7 hours. It's up to them because they control the decision making around their own kind of business unit. And then the next thing is can they control how they do it? Are there creative liberties kind of inside of it? So an employee, you tell them how to do the job, you tell them when to do the job, you tell them what to do the job with. A contractor they have their own equipment, they do it on their own time, they do it in their own method, coming to the same result, a great Sunday service, right? Ushering in the presence of the Lord. But, there's a lot of creativity and fluidity. And I think the worship leader is often one that I see that's treated that way.
I want 5 hymns sung. There will be no
right. Oh man, the
drums,
conversations we have behind the scenes around worship, right?
And would you say that while I understand we go to dol.gov, okay, we can do that, but typically I would assume that they're not even considering or thinking about churches when we go there. They're thinking about whoever companies.
Right.
So is there anything that we should think about, or is there any other place to go from a church perspective to think about those kinds of things?
Yeah. I want to say it's the Religious Freedom Alliance is a really good resource. They talk a lot about the governmental protections that we have as a church, along with how employment and religion intermingle. And they have some really good resources and case studies. I've signed up for their newsletter because I do speak to a lot of pastors and churches on where that religious freedom begins and exemptions begin, and where standard employment laws begin to apply. So that's a great additional resource. And then the United States Christian Chamber of Commerce is an amazing resource. Crystal Parker is a dynamic leader overseeing our entire nation. And so they have a plethora of resources, not only to churches, but to private businesses as well.
That's great.
So I am kind of curious too, when you deal with ticket sales and performance and all of that stuff, and you're dealing with a for-profit entity, whether that's a worship pastor, or it creates interesting situations, dynamics with unrelated business income, with religious freedom. All of these intersects when you're trying to do a for-profit, you're doing business with a for-profit entity. I would love to ask you specifically, do you recommend any strategies the church needs to take to keep healthy boundaries between that contract and the church, that contractor and the church?
Yes, absolutely. I think the biggest thing is sometimes we come into these agreements with a lot of relationship, and the formality of what's put on paper is very relaxed, and it's not attempting to foresee the consequences of when there will be a separation of doing business together. So really having those contingent plans in place and talking about, when we separate, what do we want that to look like? Who gets what? What does it look like? When does it begin? How does it end? Who can you, especially inside the church, who are you talking to about these things, these struggles, and what does discretion look like, and honoring leadership and having transparency? Because let me tell you, there's a difference between transparency and accountability. You can have a lot of people witness things and have no accountability held. And that's where a lot of church leadership gets into trouble when things do go south, is everyone knew about it, but nobody really said or stood up against the thing that maybe just didn't feel right or felt off in some kind of way. So having language when things are good and written out, and those contingency plans in place, allows for a better understanding of how those things will draw out, moment by moment.
So think about this. I want to come at it from a pastor standpoint just for a moment. I do like one thing you just said. We need to develop policies, procedures, handbooks, those kinds of things when things are good. We typically think about it when the wreck happens. Now we got to go in and create all these policies that may or may not even be relevant to what we need down the road. It just handled today.
Right.
But maybe I'm wrong here, but I think one of the biggest issues from a pastor standpoint is it's all about relationships, especially in a small church or a medium-sized church. And the pastor's job and role is to shepherd, trying to love everybody, but lead everybody. And there's a really hard balance there. So, I hire Dawn, I hire Michael, or maybe they're volunteers, part-time, whatever. And I inadvertently, whether I mean to or not, Michael comes to me, man, I need this and that. I go, okay, well, yeah, we'll do that. So I give him this other thing, then I do you, and then it causes a problem. Here I am. Now I've got these issues because Dawn says, well, what about me? And what about this? How do I kind of formalize and systematize that so that I can remove me, the pastor, from having to get into some of those difficult conversations?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the answer to that is knowing what is policy and procedure of the church and where those boundaries lie, and then what's done out of relationship and need. Right. So, there's some things, and that's where the employee handbook is so important and where that comes in. I'm actually doing an employee handbook webinar in a couple of months with the Central Florida Christian Chamber of Commerce, walking believers through how to write a handbook that not only protects their religious freedoms as a Christian-owned private company, but also to what extent can they talk about those things. And what do I not want my people coming to me and asking me for? Because those are just policies. It's not a decision the pastor's making. It's a policy that the church itself has kind of set forth. And so I think what I would encourage pastors to do is to pause when someone asks you something, and rather than saying, do I have the authority and ability to make this decision, say, is there a policy that already makes this decision for me?
Yeah.
And go revisit those documents and allow those documents to be living documents and not just something that is protecting themselves. But I think oftentimes with all the responsibilities that pastors have, they get decision fatigue and they just decide, because that's what they're there to do, is to orchestrate and to be the hub of this wheel that is just spinning with broken people and everything. And so taking that moment that you don't have to make a decision on everything right when the person's standing in front of you, and say, you know what, I'm not positive. I'm going to have to look into that and I'll get back with you. Go visit the handbook, go visit the contract, go talk to someone else about it, and don't have this decision be yours and only yours, because you can't see your own blind spots. So I think that's the safest way to instruct leadership about how to go about those difficult situations.
Donna, I have a question too, because you're talking about revisiting things. You're talking about, letting the existing policies dictate and be a living document. So based on what you see, what would you recommend a church do as far as revisiting these policies to make sure they still match, the operations and the ministry that's going on now?
Yeah. I would say those policies and procedures need to be revisited no less than 3 years, or no more than 3 years. If you can do it annually, fantastic. Because we saw through COVID how much that changed. I mean, I launched this business. This is my third business in August of 2020, and I actually launched it guiding and consulting with churches and private organizations on whether they must get a vaccine or not, and assisting employees on writing their letters of religious exemption, requiring them to get the vaccine to keep their job. So if you haven't revisited it since the pandemic, we're way behind, because that's just one big section right there that has changed. And what does hybrid work environment mean? Well, hybrid can mean you can work from home once a month. Doesn't mean it's part-time. It doesn't mean it's half the time. It doesn't mean it could be the majority of the time. You only come into the office once a month. So defining what these words mean in a world where a lot of our world is perverting our language and changing the meaning of language. And we have to stand firm on what things mean and what they do mean and what they don't mean. And continuing to kind of communicate that. So revisit the documents at least annually if you can, but don't let more than 3 years slip by, because too much legislation changes, too much law changes, too much culture changes, our leadership has changed, our jobs have changed, and more. Even if you're just going back at it and glancing at it and say, we're just going to do a review, line out anything that doesn't apply to you in your job description anymore, or write in new things that you're doing that I might not even know about as your leader because you've just picked up where things needed to be picked up.
So, man, Dawn, speaking in this issue, we could just open up cans of worms. That opens up cans of worms. That opens up cans of worms. So let's kind of wrap this particular webinar up. And I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you the question, and while you think about it, I'm going to give a teaser to maybe some upcoming webinars we might do, okay? So, Dawn, I'm a church. I know you've probably never heard this, but we're limited in our budget. I don't care what size church it is, you're going to hear that. So we're limited in our budget. Let's just say we've been asking this question in every webinar. Let's say I have about $2,500 I can put towards something to get me started working, thinking, that kind of thing. What are some possible ways that I could utilize that in the best? So while you're thinking of the answer to that, if you're watching the webinar, I'm going to commit Dawn, because while she's thinking, she can't say no. We'll do a future webinar on, like, I know this comes up a lot too. How do I terminate a staff member? That's a huge, huge deal. Another would be, I think, the sabbatical for pastors. And the third one, the last one, at least I would consider, pastors thinking about how do I address my own, sometimes it's compensation, but sometimes it's the responsibility package, and how do I address this with a board so that I stay healthy from, and that's kind of a sabbatical issue as well. So we're going to talk about some of those down the road. You want to be back on these webinars. So Dawn, help us wrap up today. I got $2,500. Here you go, Dawn. How do I do? What do I do next?
Get your org chart in line. Know who is being directed by who and who has to answer to who. Love your volunteers well. Don't burn them out, and allow them an out as well. And then so your volunteer management, to where your pastors have a good support network and they're not doing everything on their own. And then have that employee handbook to outline, this is how we do this churchy business here in this place. And then lastly, do some personality assessments. We all know that God has given us a unique and talented gift. But if you don't know how to communicate to your people, if you don't love them well, if you don't hold them accountable in a way that is palatable to them, you will lose good people. So those few investments, know who's in charge of who, know how to run the business with your business plan, your employee handbook, and know the personalities that are on the board. You get those key things done. Hopefully you can get them done for $2,500. I don't know. But I think you'll have a much smoother sailing ship if those things are well covered.
Well, and I guess since I'm leading the webinar, I can give shameless plugs. But when you go to simpleministry.org, you'll see we have a video there that'll explain to you too how you can do a ministry imprint for every member of your church, not just your leaders, and for pennies, not even going to be close to $2,500. It's going to be much, much less. But it allows you to know how to put every volunteer into the right role, match them to the ministries in your church, and then also your board, your leaders. So I would encourage you, check that out, simpleministry.org. One thing I'll say, and then I want to wrap up with how do we get in touch with you guys, and I want you to do that. But we do a lot of coaching and consulting with churches, helping them think through org charts and all that kind of stuff. But there's a thought that I've used for a long time. What if I could make one decision that would prevent me from making 1,000 decisions down the road? I would rather slow down and make that one good decision, which is my handbook, my guidelines. There could be a lot of things there. If I can get this one thing right, it stops me from having to do all of these other things down the road. So, just getting the job descriptions, the handbooks, those kind of things. So these are things that we can, if we can't do it, we can point you to somebody hopefully that can. So Dawn, thank you for being on today. Tell us, how can we get a hold of you? So Dawn Sipley, Sipley the best. She's got this coolest little logo. If you get a chance to go over there and look at it, it's an octopus. And man, I just love what you're doing. So tell us about, how do we get a hold of you?
Yeah, so simplythebest.com. We are also on all the socials: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We've got an amazing newsletter that I only put out twice a month that is just full of resources, legislative changes, trends in the workforce, best practices, to be our best version of servant leaders that we can be. So Simply the Best is our handle all the way across. So, and then our podcast, Hiring Happy Humans, where we talk about how to hire and keep happy people in the workplace.
And just so they don't get confused on how to spell Sipley the best for them.
Yep. It's right here on my screen. SIP is in Peter, LEY. So it's my last name proper. Simplythebest.com.
There you go. All right. Thank you again for being on. Michael, how do we get a hold of you and Ministry Sure?
Yeah, so we're on all the socials as well, and ministrysure.com. My personal email is mike@ministrysure.com. Love to connect with you and interact online through LinkedIn. We do post on ministry resources all the time and are working on our newsletter. We're not quite there yet, Dawn. Yeah, we just love hearing from you and interacting and trying to find the best resources we can to shore up your ministry.
Well, good. I'm Dr. Rodney Agan, simpleministry.org. And our tagline we're using really now is where ministry meets technology. So we've got a lot of things that we can help you to do. Thanks again for all of you being on. And if you're watching the webinar, keep posted, because we're going to have Dawn back on in another, at least one or two more. So we'll go from there. Have a great day.